So it is my immense pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Writers at Work. My name is Bob Jacobson from the Physics Department. Like many of you, I'm here to learn from greatness. This is a program that's been going on since 1997. It's had a wide range of people come to talk about their process. It focuses on people from the campus, our colleagues, across many, many disciplines. And part of the greatness of Berkeley is that we can come together and learn from each other despite the craziness in the world that lives around us. Today, I'm very pleased that we have Professor Jeff Nunberg from our School of Information here. I have his biography in front of me, which is like 2.5 pages printed tiny. But let me point out a couple of very important things. He's been here since 2001. And the thing that makes it interesting is that before that, he had been at Columbia, Penn, Tiny Type, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, UCLA, the University of Rome, and the University of Naples. So that's really tough competition. But he's come here, and he's stayed here, and I think Berkeley should be proud of that. He's well known for many writings, including several books that we are carrying around and you'll hear about later on. But he's also known through appearing on NPR and the BBC, and perhaps some of you will recognize his voice from those. The program today is that he's going to read a little bit from his writings, and then John Levine of our own writing program will interview him in the comfy chairs out front to discuss a wide range of things. And I'm all looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Professor Nunberg.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John, for organizing this, and thank you all for coming. It's kind of intimidating to be in this series, given the people who've been here before, and even the name writer seems a little presumptuous, but I console myself that I at least satisfy Thomas Mann's definition of a writer, someone who finds writing more difficult than other people do. So, what I'd like to do is, and I have voice problems, so I don't know how this is going to work, but I'd like to read a few passages from a book I published that was published in 2012 called Ascent of the A-Word. It's about the word asshole, and I'm going to just use the word and assume that this is Berkeley. We're Berkeley. We're not, Southern Methodist. As you'll see, there's a particular reason why I've chosen to read these passages. Now, the idea, I should say, of the book, and a lot of the work I do, is to look at language, but to find the smallest and most inconsequential words, or the words that nobody pays attention to, or the words that people think beneath their dignity to discuss, and look at them and see what they reveal about us and the culture. One of the pieces I was most proud of doing on Fresh Air was a long piece, not that long piece, on why conservatives use "and" more than liberals do. It was a great point of entry because you're looking at the least word of English. This book was inspired by a couple of things. One, actually, I'd seen a book in French called De la Connerie, which was about kind of the equivalent word assholism or something like that in French. And then in 2005, back then I was writing for the New York Times Week in Review section. I was writing about talk radio and political discourse and so on. And it struck me that a point that Michael Tomasky's made, that what's happened to American political discourse, particularly on the right, is that issues have taken a backseat to rhetoric. It's really rhetoric that drives the discussion rather than issues. And I was interested in the rhetorical style, not simply the words used, but the mode of interaction, particularly on talk radio. When I worked at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, I used to come back home listening to along 280, listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I figured, well, I'm an angry white guy. It's okay if I listen to this. So let me find this where this starts. This is, hang on. I have to read it from the book because it's not. The idea that asshole could be a proxy for the fraying fabric of public life first struck me in 2005, just before things got really squirrely. I was writing about the language of politics and listening to a lot of right-wing talk on radio and TV, and I kept noticing how everything seemed to be aimed at depicting liberals as, well, assholes. Not that anybody actually ever used assholes on the air, bleeped or not. There's only one occurrence I found on Fox News where a guest accused somebody of being an asshole. But that isn't the point. It's rather that asshole seems to encapsulate the animus that the shows are both stoking and stroking. It's a word we reserve for members of our own tribe. The boss who takes credit for your work, the neighbors who get on your case for putting out your garbage the night before, or maybe a well-known politician or celebrity. It isn't a word you use for Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. It signals indignation with an undercurrent of contempt, an emotion you can only feel toward those you feel superior to and familiar with. And that in turn legitimates a certain energizing response, combative, derisory, with more than a splash of asshole itself, that's compelling enough to keep listeners tuned in, which after all is the point of the exercise. Or if the listeners are of an opposing political viewpoint, as many of them are, they can enjoy the rush of head-clearing rage that comes at the host's assholistic harangues. Assholes are people who allow us to be assholes back at them. They turn us into anti-assholes, a word I think of being less like antitoxin than antimatter. Stuff just like matter, but with the opposite charge, which reacts with matter violently. Excuse me, just take a huge amount of this programming is aimed at creating exchanges and narratives that generate these feelings by turning reports about remote evils into pretexts for stirring up more intimate antipathies. During the build-up to the Iraq War, more than half the Fox News segments on Iraq focused on the pusillanimity of the French who were refusing to go along with the invasion, and through them, on the pretentious American Francophile liberals who spoke their language and consumed their wines and cheese. Saddam Hussein may have been an Oriental despot out of central casting, but he was too alien to be the object of the contempt that only familiarity can breed. Not that conservatives always had to manufacture such pretext. You can't live in San Francisco and teach at Berkeley, as I do, without being impressed by the myriad forms of assholism that bourgeois liberalisms nourish. The pretension and superiority, the preciosity, the way laudable commitments to social justice sit cheek by jowl with intrusive paternalism. Berkeley's always been a place where people believe that consenting adults should be allowed to do whatever they please in the privacy of their own bedroom, so long as they don't try to smoke afterwards. The truth is that the dynamic I'm interested in here, the play of asshole and anti-asshole, is fed by the abundant strains of assholism that run through every corner of American life. What struck me in 2005 was the way the play of asshole and anti-asshole was bubbling up into the public sphere like a sadistic form of performance art. Read a little bit of the following introduction and then mind your manners, asshole. It ought to be a lame joke, a blatantly self-undermining sentence like watch your mouth, fuckwad. But it doesn't strike most of people as funny right off. In fact, it's a cliche that most of us have had occasion to utter, or at least mutter, though sometimes the mind your manners part can be dispensed with. A bald asshole can make the point all by itself. Indeed, who lives a life so fortunate that the sentence never crosses their mind? Asshole is a basic category of our everyday existence, our reflexive remonstrance for people who behave thoughtlessly or arrogantly on the job, in personal relationships, or just circulating in public. It's the word that comes immediately to mind when a neighbor starts his leaf blower at 7:15 on Saturday morning, or a driver behind us scoots into the parking space we were about to back into. It's the word that's left unspoken in the glances we exchange with the other passengers at the airport gate, where a businessman is loudly berating the agent for not giving him an upgrade. Or if we're being honest with ourselves, it's the word people yell or mutter at us when we do those things, and the one we use to apologize for them on those fleeting occasions when it's given to us to realize how we must have sounded to others. True, there are some of us who won't say the word. The proportion of Americans who claim they never curse runs from 6 to 19%, and you figure some of them must be telling the truth. But it's one thing to refuse to let a word pass your lips, and another to exclude the concept it stands for from your mental life. Still, there's a paradoxical irony in appending asshole to mind your manners. Asshole is the paradigmatic example of a rude word. In two meanings of rude, it's both indecent and coarse, and unmannerly and uncivil. So it's striking that it should be the word we instinctively reach for to rebuke inconsiderate behavior. A lot of people would see that as a telling sign of what we come to, rude even in the way we condemn rudeness. People who deplore the mounting incivility of a modern society invariably cite the increase of swearing and foul language as Exhibit A, right up with cell phone abuse, telemarketers, and aggressive drivers. And a lot of them signal out the word asshole for special mention. I go on to talk about the meaning of the word and why it's distinct from other words. And toward the end of the book, I discuss three figures who exemplify the various forms that what I call assholism. It's too bad we don't have that word. Can take. The book's really more about assholism than assholes. The first of those is Steve Jobs, who was an interesting character. The third of them was not Mark Zuckerberg, but the Mark Zuckerberg who was depicted in the social, the social network, because he evidently is quite different from that figure. And the second was Donald Trump, which is why I picked this today. I was 4 years ahead of my time. If I'd published this book last year, it would be, Donald Trump comes closer than anyone else to being the archetype of the species, the asshole species. Crossing genres, he exemplifies all the ways an asshole can capture our attention. He's in a different league from Patton or Jobs, whose assholism is perceived relative to their other achievements. They'd be remembered even if they'd been even-tempered and self-effacing, though perhaps not the subjects of a best-selling biography or an Oscar-winning biopic. Whereas Trump would have no more claims to our attention than Harold Hamm, Charles Ergen, Daneen Avara, or most of the other 100-odd Americans who have more money than he does. But Trump is a pure asshole in the way that very few people are ever a pure anything, as one-dimensional as the villain in a Batman movie. Everything he says reveals the workings of a hermetically self-referential mind. Here he is explaining his objections to gay marriage. It's like in golf. I can't do Trump. Alec Baldwin should be here. It's like in golf. A lot of people, I don't want this to sound trivial, but a lot of people are switching to these really long putters, very unattractive. It's weird. You see these great players with these long putters because they can't sink three-footers anymore. And I hate it. I'm a traditionalist. I have so many fabulous friends who happen to be gay, but I am a traditionalist. Colbert did a nice riff on that thing. Not even Stephen Colbert could have come up with anything with that. Whatever else can be said about Trump, he writes his own stuff. And controversial as he is in other regards, no one disputes that he's an asshole, though some people have very different reasons for finding him compelling. Some regard him with de haut en bas disdain. In the heyday of the 1980s, Spy magazine made a fetish of his arriviste coarseness, with a recurrent epithet, short-fingered vulgarian. In respect, the not our class dear condescension of that phrase is a reminder of how tricky it is to deride an asshole from above. Others take pleasure in seething at his outrageousness. His presidential foray in early 2011, I lost my place. In early 2011, with its opportunistic rekindling of the birther dementia, briefly made him topic A, not just on the right, but on the left. The Huffington Post mentions of Trump trail only those of Sarah Palin, who's been at the game much longer. And at the time, even his online supporters conceded that he was an asshole, though they either looked past it or saw it as a plus. To some, it meant that he was someone who would get the job done, a la Patton. To others, that he wouldn't mince words in letting the world know what an asshole Barack Obama is. I got quoted a few online comments like, Trump may be an arrogant asshole, but he says what he thinks. I will vote for Trump precisely because he's a jerk, but a jerk who knows what he's doing, and so on. And a lot of comments of that sort. Trump's preeminence in this line testifies to his mastery of the mechanisms of publicity. Apart from Colbert, no one in public life better understands how engaging assholism can be, both in real life and its broadcast simulacra. The Apprentice epitomizes the genre of reality television built around situations in which people can be abusive to others who have willingly consented to take part in return for money or celebrity. Every episode arcs toward a finale that gives the viewers the opportunity to watch a powerful man acting like an asshole toward his supplicants, dispatching the losing competitor with a brisk, "You're fired." The phrase is supposed to evoke the pitilessness it takes to survive in, quote, the ultimate jungle. But we don't actually feel much compassion for the losers. They fought to get there, after all, and any residual sympathy we might have for them is dissipated in the final boardroom scene where they're incited to act like assholes themselves, selling each other out in an effort to be spared the axe. So there's none of the vicarious outrage we might feel watching a movie of the week that depicts Leona Helmsley summarily discharging a busboy who spilled some tea on her saucer. I then talk a little bit about Trump's political foray. I don't know how much time have I taken. Let me read one more piece from that same period, and again about a small word that that I thought was interesting. This is from 2008, December 2008. I see what, oh, sorry. In 1942, FDR's Vice President Henry Wallace made a famous speech in which he declared we were living in, quote, the century of the common man. For most of this century, the common man went by the name of Joe. The generic Joe Blow first showed up in the 1920s, along with his aliases Joe Bloggs and Joe Zilch, to be joined later by Joe Schmo from Kokomo. And by the 30s, Joe had replaced John and Jack as a generic word for a chap or fellow, as in a good Joe or a regular Joe. Perhaps that was because Joe seemed ethnically more inclusive and urban than John. Josephs have always been thicker on the ground in New York than in Arkansas. G.I. Joe made his first appearance in 1942 as a comic strip character in the Army weekly Yank. He quickly took the place of Johnny Doughboy, a holdover from World War I. Since that period, Joe has been the name people reached for whenever they wanted to suggest blue-collar unpretentiousness. You think of Joe Palooka, the affable heavyweight champ from a popular comic strip that dated from the 30s, or Jackie Gleason's garrulous Joe the bartender, or Josephine the plumber, who was featured in long-running ads for Comet Cleaner in the 1960s. Joe Camel slouched onto the scene a couple of decades later, shooting pool with his baseball cap on backwards, or sitting on his motorcycle in a black leather jacket, always with a cigarette dangling from his split lip. Man or dromedary, you couldn't imagine him as a Jeremy. Joe Lunchpail appeared in the 1960s, and William Safire has traced Joe's six-pack back to a 1970 Boston congressional race. At the time, some people heard the phrase as a slur on Irish voters, but it caught on as a slightly jocular handle for ordinary working-class Americans. Homer Simpson embraced the label and expanded it, calling himself a regular Joe 12-pack. Those are the voters both parties have been wooing since the late 1960s, but usually under oblique labels like the silent majority or working Americans or the forgotten middle class. The working class and lower middle class have no entries in the American political lexicon. Pundits and politicos on both sides might endlessly chew over the question, what does Joe Sixpack want? But the gentleman was referred to only in the third person. Before Sarah Palin, no national candidate had ever addressed Joe Sixpack by name, much less offered themselves as a representative of what Palin called the normal Joe Sixpack American. And then in one of those you can't make this stuff up moments, the NJSA, National Normal Joe Sixpack American constituency acquired a flesh and blood embodiment in the form of an Ohio man who happened to go by the name of Joe the Plumber and who worked in a canonical research 20th century blue-collar job. This was pure serendipity. There's no way Wurzelbacher was the guy. Would have been transformed into a campaign mascot if he'd been Dwayne the drywall guy. Between the mediagenic double teaming of Joe the Plumber and Joe Sixpack identified vice presidential candidate, Republicans' populist pitch was even more explicit and energetic than at any time since Nixon and Agnew ignited the culture wars 40 years ago. Their partisans were adrenalized, piling into Palin's rallies with placards bearing their first names and job descriptions. But outside of the Republican base, there was no rush to enroll in the Joe Sixpack nation. Of course, there are lots of reasons for that. Some had feared that Palin might incarnate Joe Sixpack a little too authentically, and Joe the Plumber turned out to be something of a loose spigot. And then most people simply had a number of other things on their minds. But whatever candidates happened to be carrying the Republican standard in 2012, it isn't likely, it isn't likely they'll be bringing along any of this year's Joes when they make their way back to Ohio and Pennsylvania. That's the risk of populist rhetoric. What sounds plain folks in one ear will sound patronizing in another. Notwithstanding Henry Wallace's glorious speech or Aaron Copland's even more glorious fanfare, the common man has never been crazy about being referred to as the common man. And with the notable exception of Homer Simpson, most people aren't comfortable having their socio-political identity reduced to a beverage preference, whether it's for beer or Chardonnay. Americans may still feel a nostalgic affection for the picturesque working-class characters the name Joe evoked in the last century. But when they catch a glimpse of themselves in a mirror, well, it's funny, but they don't look Joe-ish.
I want to thank you again, Jeff, for agreeing to come to this. And I'm glad you read from that book. I just finished reading it, and you say that you were 4 years off. I would say that you were prescient. I mean, because who knew? I mean, we talk about last summer during the debates, the Republican debates, that the Republican candidate would be Donald Trump, and yet you get to it about halfway through the book, but it's really hard to avoid him when you talk about an asshole. I want to say that I recommend this book, and that it's laid out very logically. By the time we get to Donald Trump in the book, it all makes sense. He fits the definition of what you've laid out here. So the thrust of our conversation will be about your writing and your writing process, but given the season and given this is post the day following the third debate, we really can't avoid the topic. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about how language has been altered or at least colored by the presidential campaign. So you wrote on the Berkeley blog just last week, you talked about You've compared Trump's revival to the Nixon-era dog whistle Law and Order, how that's come about. And then also, I'm hoping we can talk about some of these words that have come out, among them bigly, which I think is a word in the dictionary, but he has brought it front and center.
Well, I have to say that if you're interested in political language, this campaign has been very disappointing. Why is that? Well, because it's sui generis. I mean, Trump is Trump. Nobody else talks like Trump. Presumably that language, if Trump's around for the next 8 years, we may have a different situation, but on the presumption that Hillary will win, which it now seems likely, that language will subside. And the language that had characterized both sides, I wrote a book in 2006 called Talking Right. Do you have that book? Because I can't ever remember the full title.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah. Talking Right, How Conservatives Turned Liberalism into a Tax-Raising, Latte-Drinking, Sushi-Eating, Volvo-Driving, New York Times Reading, Body-Piercing, Hollywood-Loving, Left-Wing Freak Show. I had a long conversation with a Hungarian translator of that title. That kind of language, the talk of values and traditional values, talk of big government, talk of the nanny state, all of that we haven't heard. We heard it during the primaries. And then when Trump emerged as the Republican candidate, it disappeared. At the same time, we heard some of the traditional left-wing rhetoric, left rhetoric, during the primaries, when Clinton and Sanders were engaging. That's disappeared now too, because she doesn't have to do that. So from the standpoint of political language, it's kind of disappointing. Trump as a character in himself is fascinating. So we could talk about his language and what he does with it. And in certain ways, I think he does represent not simply a black swan, as they say, but maybe a gray swan. There's been a trend in American political language really since the 1920s to make political language and public language in general more colloquial, more conversational, less rhetorical than it used to be. It's interesting because for the students, Paul Dugan and I teach a class called History of Information, and at one point I played for them a tape of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's famous fireside chats, which were at the time, and for a long time, considered this breakthrough. He sat there and talked to Americans on the radio in their living room, and they felt for the first time that they had a personal relationship with the president. What's interesting is that when you listen to them now, the language sounds rather stiff and formal. By the standards of the way Barack Obama might talk on an evening talk show. So this has been going on for a long time, and Trump just takes it to the logical conclusion. I mean, there's no difference, as best I can tell, between the way Trump talks at a debate or on the podium, behind the podium, and the way he just talks in an interview, and the way presumably he talks around the dinner table. It's the same language. For that reason, I'll say one more thing about it. People do they use these Flesch-Kincaid scales to determine who's, the reading level. That's really kind of not appropriate. Those scales were designed to measure the appropriateness of school textbooks and healthcare information and so on. They really weren't meant to be applied to political discourse. But there's another measure you can use that's interesting called the type-token ratio. That is to say, in a stretch of 1,000 words, how many distinct dictionary words does someone use? If they used one word, the type-token ratio would be 1, only one word over and over again. If they used 1,000 different words, it would be 1,000. So it's going to be somewhere in that range. Most politicians fall in kind of the same range, both left and right, both Democrat and Republican. Ted Cruz tends to be a little higher than others. Mm-hmm. Trump is at the bottom. It's way distinct from the others. So what you could say about him is that he's a man of a lot of words, and he repeats them. A man of few words, but he repeats them all the time.
Yes.
And that's what he does. He just repeats the same words over and over again. He doesn't feel the need to be to persuade his audience, I think. And it struck me that the point of political rhetoric isn't to persuade your audience to agree with you. It's to remind them that they already do. Mm-hmm. And Trump is genius at that.
Right. So that's part of his appeal, his language.
Yeah.
So moving on to you in language, can you tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in language?
I think it's something that happens early on, and I think most people have an interest in language. People always say, I'm a word lover, and they think it makes them special, but I don't know anybody who doesn't think they're special because they're a word lover. So I was interested in language early on. My dad was a fastidious speaker of English. He was very careful to, he said, well, this is correct and that's incorrect and so on. Maybe that it happened there, but for whatever reason, I was interested in language. I went to college. I dropped out for a while. I went to art school for a while, and then I went back. This was at Columbia. And I took a course in linguistics with this woman who was an extraordinary teacher. And the scales fell from my eyes. Most people don't come to Berkeley or wherever wanting to be a linguist. You know, it's something they discover rather than late in life, where it's not an ambition that's burning in your breast when you're 11. So I discovered it, I loved this, and I just went on with it.
And you write a lot about language. It seems there's never an unending source of something to say about it. I'm so impressed with your the number of articles, your fresh air commentaries. Can you talk a little bit about how you get your ideas about what to write about? What strikes your fancy about a word or language?
Sometimes it's hard. I have a long list of things that I think will be, you have to find something, not just that. I get a lot of emails, why don't you write about this or that, or rigged or whatever. And I think, do I have 900 words to say about rigged or whatever? I mean, it's obviously an interesting word. I have a friend, Ed Koren, maybe many know, he's the New Yorker cartoonist who draws the kind of fuzzy animals and monsters and so on. And Koren and I were once in New York where we were crossing a street, or we were about to cross the street, and he pulled me back and said, no, here come the elephants, as these cars came. And I thought, Koren walks around New York City and the world just disposes itself in the form of Ed Koren cartoons and so on. So I think at a certain point you're listening in that way and you say, there's a piece there, there's a piece there. My word of the year, and I try to find words that, as I say, other people are less focused on. My word of the year last year was gig. I do a word of the year thing. And what I thought was, I wonder who first used gig. It had been musician slang for a long time, right, since the beginning of the 20th century, but for a job. But who first used gig for a job in general? And I made a bet with myself that it would be Jack Kerouac, and it was Jack Kerouac, who, after all, the Beats were into jazz and also thought of life that way and so on. And from that came the possibility of going from Kerouac to the gig economy and tracing the idea of the American job through that word. But it's always a question of finding the connection of a small word to a big story. That's all I can say.
So back to gigs. So then it lay dormant for a while because, and then with the current so-called gig economy we have, it came back.
It became kind of middle-class slang, hipster slang for a job. You go into a coffee house and you get the barista, and he's, I got a gig here. It's like, hey man, I don't really do this. I'm just here. And it's picked up for the gig economy. Now for Kerouac, the idea was that your job didn't define you. At a time when the American job was the great moment of the American job, and after the war, with strong unions and social welfare programs and lifetime employment and so on, that was the great moment of American job. And that the hipsters, the Beats turned their back on that was a very significant. To call it a gig like a musician's job was significant. By the time it's being used for the gig economy, it suggests, in a certain sense, this idea of freedom. You just got a gig. You can move around from one thing to another, whatever. You're working for Uber. You don't have to do this, and it's what the people who are pushing this like to the freedom it gives you. It also gives you no security and so on and so forth. And as I said in that piece. Gig is the slang word you use for a job when you want to pretend you don't really need one. That was the idea of the piece.
Speaking of Uber and the gig economy, I just made a list of just a small sample of the titles of your commentaries. Now, I'm wondering, actually, let me share some of these. Yada Yada Do, Uber and Out, 10 Suffixes That Change the World, Sex and the Singular Verb, Caucasian Talk Circles, Begin the Regime, The Icebox Goeth. Do you come up with these titles while you're writing? Because on Fresh Air commentaries, we don't get to hear the titles.
And when they put them on the web, they're always these dreary titles. I don't even try to make. But now, I used to put them up on my own website. Now, NPR puts them up on the web with these dreary titles and whatever. And if I publish them again, I use I use my own titles, which
But
I
you
think
do
are,
come up with titles for
yeah,
each piece.
yeah.
How do you do it? They're wonderful. They're remarkable.
Well, there's a trend. It began in the 1920s with Time magazine of using punning titles, and it became a fixture of a certain kind of middle brow publication, Time magazine and the New Republic and so on and so forth. If you see, they're going to have a punning title, and so I'm just in that. The gig is up or something like
Right.
that. You look for a pun that involves the word, but it's just in that tradition of puns.
Well, I talk to my writing students all the time about the importance of titles. I mean, whether it's a pun or not. I strongly suggest that they come up with a title, if not in the early stages of their draft, after they've written a draft. So I'm curious, do you know the title while you're writing it? When does the title come in? When do you title your pieces?
Every once in a while, I know the title of a piece, but more often, after the fact, I think, what's the punning phrase I can use here? I did write this piece about and, which I called, and I knew I wanted to write the piece, The Politics of Polysyndeton. Polysyndeton being the Greek name, the rhetorical name for using a lot of ands. So that was one where I did that. But for the most part, no, the titles come after the fact.
So speaking of, I don't know if we want to call that jargon, but a word that most people wouldn't know, would you say you have multiple styles when you're writing, perhaps for an academic setting versus a popular setting for the New York Times, Fresh Air? Do you shift into different gears when you're writing for different audiences?
It's astonishing how different the gears are. What I was reading from the book was it wasn't an academic style, but it was, let's say a more, I don't want to say literary, but it had the kind of literary cadences and longer sentences and punctuation and so on. When I wrote for the New York Times, there's a different style you use. And when I write for Fresh Air, sometimes I'll do a Times piece and they don't want it and I'll rewrite it for Fresh Air. It's a big deal. I mean, sometimes it won't even work. And it's really hard to rewrite it for radio. Radio's particularly special or difficult form to write for.
Can you talk a little bit about
that? You're writing. You're writing to be heard. You can't really develop an argument of any complexity on the radio. People are sitting in their cars and so on. You want to create what people call the driveway moment, where people get home and sit in their driveway to hear the rest of the piece. But it's very different. The processor that we use when we're processing speech is different from the one we use when we're reading, and you have to accommodate that. For instance, a very small thing: you don't, when you're writing for the radio, use little interpolated phrases like "This, I believe, is the first time she ever did it." You say, "I believe this is the first time she ever did it," or "It's the first time she ever did it, I believe. This apparently was..." So those adverbs and little phrases that you stick in the middle, quite normally in writing, don't work on the radio. Lists don't work very well on the radio. 3 or 4 things, but after that, a list doesn't work. And of course, they work wonderfully in writing a book like that. And then when you come to the end of the piece, you don't have the little square, a dark square that signals, okay, the piece is over. That you go and you know where you're coming to. Or when you're reading a book, you have the space between your thumb and your forefinger. It's a wonderful line in Northanger Abbey, the beginning of the last chapter of Northanger Abbey. Jane Austen says, "My readers will know from the diminishing number of pages before us that we are hastening together toward perfect felicity." But you don't have that. So you have to sort of write a sentence that says, okay, now we're coming to the end, and now we're about to be the end, and now I'm the last sentence, and here's a kicker to tell you it's the last sentence. And it really has to end in a way that's very bright like that.
Yes, and being an avid radio listener, I can tell, I can anticipate that. Is this something you learned through trial and error? Did you take a class in radio broadcasting? How did you come back?
I work with the same producer. I was working for 27 years. I've been working with the same producer at Fresh Air, and she's helped me a lot. She says, "You can't use that word. My people don't know that word. I don't know that word." We have fights about that. I said, you'd let Lloyd Schwartz use the word. He's the classical music critic. She said, "Well, that's Lloyd. No, you can't use it." So some of it I learned from her, and some of it I just learned doing it. And sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, I always have the sense that I'm fighting against the constraints of the genre. I'm writing sentences that are too long to fit into a breath group. So I don't know if I've mastered it yet. Sometimes it works.
So when you write a piece for, say, Fresh Air to be spoken, how much revision goes into that? Have you come to a point where you know the form now and you can fill that form, or is there much?
It just takes longer and longer and more versions. And as I say, writers are people who find, and then getting from one thing to another. You know, my theory about writing, here's my entire theory of writing.
Please.
Writing is 10% inspiration, 10% perspiration, 80% transitions. Right, and it's
Okay.
So getting from A to B, you have little bits of. I mean, usually you start with a little bit of shtick or something like that, or an observation about a word. I just did a piece on well, it's complicated. I did a piece on the word pussy, and it was complicated for Fresh Air because you can't say pussy on National Public Radio. They even got upset that I used the word P word too much. They said, "Can you cut out some of the P?" I said, "Come on." So I had a few observations about that word. One, the idea that it's not only the word that we use when we're talking about a woman's genital area in a specifically sexual way, but it's also the word we use when we reduce women to an organ, simply to a sexual function. He gets a lot of pussy in the sense in which you talk about workers as hands or children as mouths to feed, and so on. So I began with that, and then had to find a way, a story that would end with that. And I think that's the way writers work. They start with a scene, or a vision or a picture, and they put it together around that.
That reminds me of words that you can and cannot say on the radio. So there are certain words that George Carlin had the famous routine, and I think the number has been diminished since he did his routine. What's the current number of verboten words?
There's no list. There's never been a list.
Oh, okay. But certain things that you can say that the FCC will allow, and then in print, there are certain newspapers that will print a word, others will put in those symbols. The New Yorker, I think it's no holds barred. They will print anything. So what does that say about our culture, about, I don't know, I'm not sure what the question is.
You can use these words more certainly than you can. When I was doing the book on asshole, and I was using the Google Ngram tool, which allows you to track the changing frequency of words over time in the Google Books corpus. A wonderful tool, ngrams.google labs, whatever. I wanted to track how frequent asshole was, whether people were using asshole more. The problem is that one reason that asshole is more frequent is just that you can print all those words at a certain point. You become. So I tracked the relative frequency of you asshole and your asshole. The assumption being that the second one, your asshole, would be only in the anatomical sense, and that one sort of rises to a certain point and then levels off, and you asshole keeps going up, meaning that the first rise is due to the fact that you can print the word, and after that to the fact that people are using it as an insult more than. I think there's something to be said for not using the words. The New York Times used every word in Trump's tape on the front page for the first time. Not the first time that fucking was ever used in the Times. Only the second time it had appeared in the Times, but the first time was as an expletive in a story about a slum, whatever. This is the first time it had ever appeared with its literal meaning. First time pussy had ever appeared with its sexual meaning. Tits they used occasionally, but they put it on the page, on the front page for the first time, and that meant something. They were saying this is different. We at the Times feel they have two arguments. One is we're a family newspaper. These shouldn't have. Well, if you were a family newspaper, you'd have a comics page, right? You're not a family newspaper. But the second argument, they stand for civility in public discourse. And we have this kind of fiction that these words don't exist in public discourse. And I think it's good to have that fiction. I mean, for one thing, swearing wouldn't mean anything if you weren't breaking a taboo, right? So you have to do a certain amount of work to keep the. I mean, how do you learn to swear? You have to be told not to use the words, and then hear the words used, ideally by the same people. But that business of establishing the taboos and keeping them there is, among other things, what keeps swearing alive.
Yes, when anyone who's a parent, you have a certain relationship with swearing and what you can do in front of your kids, and
Right. And the interesting thing, just add this, the interesting thing about Trump is he was not swearing. Before, every time Joe Biden or George W. Bush has been caught out, it's for swearing. Trump was not swearing. He was using these words in a different way.
Right. Interesting. So do you have a sense of, does this mean, so you talk about civility a lot in the ascent of the A word. Do you have a sense of where we are or where we're going in terms of our level of civility based on language usage?
You know, it's very hard. If I wrote a sequel to the political book, it wouldn't be about the language, because I think the language is less interesting now, but about the way in which language is used. And it's certainly the case. I said in that little video thing for Berkeley that you get the feeling all of public discourse is one long comments thread. And there's a sense this merging of public and private language also means that the sanctions, the rules, the taboos, that used to apply in public no longer apply. So it's very confused now and very complicated. I don't think that people are less civil in general than they were. And if you look at the surveys that are done of civility, people are still civil at the dinner table. They're civil usually to their work in the workplace and so on and so forth. It's more in public life and in public settings that this kind of incivility emerges, and I don't know what to say about it.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned the importance of transitions in writing, and I have no way to make a smooth transition to what I want to talk about next, but I do want to hear a little bit more about your writing process. So it is not as easy as it comes off. I mean, we all assume that writing is easy when we read someone else's writing. So can you talk a little bit about how you proceed? Once you have an idea, how do you proceed? Do you take notes? Do you outline?
I start throwing sentences down and bits down on a page and then moving them around. I didn't write like this when I had a typewriter. I mean, the word processor obviously changes. You write everything all the time, And I wrote this paper for Philosophy Journal a while ago, and I kept working on it, and I realized at a certain point there's probably no sentence in this paper that was written all at the same time, right? So I write bits down and put them together. If they're in fresh air, you want a little story. You want to come up with, and you want something surprising. My sense about language is that it should be surprising, and it's hard to say surprising stuff about language. Most of what you read about language is not surprising. It may be entertaining, but when you read people fulminating about what's happening to the English language, or other people fulminating about the people who fulminate about what's happening to the English language, it's rarely surprising. It may be entertaining, but it's not. So I'm looking for a surprise. I'm looking for a little story, and you kind of put things together until you have a story. That's all I can.
So those are the shorter pieces. When you're working on a longer form, on a book, Talking Right or The Ascent of the A Word, is it the same process where you just throw sentences down? And
No.
Okay.
There it was. I had a sense of with the extent the A Word book, for example. I was interested in this word and how it came into the language, and as it came into the language, really in the late '60s, early '70s, it began to displace other languages, other words, in certain settings. The human potential movement, est, for those who, if anybody remembers est, was sort of the granddaddy of the human. They made a point of calling the people who came to the meetings assholes and so on. And some people call them est-holes, in fact. In movies, you began to get the Clint Eastwood, the Dirty Harry character, who used asshole in a very specific way and so on, and it became that. As feminism rose, it became the word that displaced older words like cad. Men are all assholes. That's a 1972 thought, a second generation feminist thought, and there really was no word that did that work. In ordinary usage, it displaced words. People read the Catcher in the Rye. Holden Caulfield's all about phonies, and it's interesting to go through the Catcher in the Rye and look at every occurrence of phony and say, what would you say now? You wouldn't say phony for most of them. You'd say asshole for some and not for others, and so on. So it was an addition to the moral life in that way, and it infiltrated all of these different domains. And I had a chapter on feminism, a chapter on human potential, a chapter on political language, and so on. It was better organized than Fresh Air Pieces.
So it sounds
obviously.
like you've been following this. You'd had this idea for a while, and at a certain time you said, I'm going to write this book. I mean, it wasn't as though you sat down and researched this and didn't have any idea about these references you make. So I'm curious about when did the time come to write this book for you?
It took a while to. It took a couple of years to write that book. I mean, what I'll often do now, the wonderful thing about the world now is you have the web and you have all these other resources. So you can look at not just at the history of the words, but their changing frequency. You can do that very quickly in a way that, if the Oxford English Dictionary took 40 years, and they assembled in the preparation of that dictionary, I think 4 million citations on little slips of paper. Now you can get 4 million citations in an afternoon. It's very different. So you can take, if it's words you're interested in, you can start tracking the words and how they're used and how people have used them in the past and so on. And that inspires certain thoughts, and you go from there.
Okay. Back to your writing process. Do you have a regular routine, a time that you write, a place that you write?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, I write in the mornings and I write late at night. I mean, that generally tends to be when I write, but I'm not disciplined in the way real writers are. I think of Ernest Hemingway standing at the little lectern on the table and writing. I think of Norman Mailer saying at one point, you become professional means that you get 2,000 words a day, whether you're there or not. I've never quite been able to do that when I'm doing these things. When it's linguistics, I can do that. But when it's scholarly work, I can do that because you're just putting the ideas down. You're not looking for the words in the narrative in the same way.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. So when you are doing linguistics work, what's the process that's different from writing more of the mainstream pieces?
Well, because with linguistics, you're thinking through a scientific problem. How do these words work and so on. Now, you may spend a lot of time thinking about the words and working that out, but it's what you're trying to do in linguistics is to describe something independent of the language you're describing it with. The way you say things in linguistics isn't terribly important. In fact, linguistics, if in fields like linguistics or other sciences you write too well, it's kind of suspicious because what's he trying to put over on me, right? You want, and that's what makes linguistics different from, say, history, I think. Mm-hmm. But so you don't want the language to do the work, and for that reason, it's much easier to do than other kinds of writing.
Because you have that specialized audience that's aware of the moves.
Right, right.
Yes.
And you're moving chess pieces around. Yeah.
Interesting. So you say you're not disciplined, but you said you write in the morning, you write in the evening. Do you write every day?
No.
No.
But I write in spurts. What I like about writing a book as opposed to the Fresh Air piece or anything is the Fresh Air piece you have to keep starting a new piece and you have to keep finding it and looking for it and so on, and it can be and you don't know. Sometimes you think, oh, that'll be a great piece, and you write 500 words and you say, this isn't working. I have a huge file of things that didn't work, I thought would work and just didn't work. They were too complicated, they were too simple or whatever, or the story wasn't one that would work for those venues. So I can't remember what the question was now.
I can't either, but,
Okay.
but I think you answered it. Do you write on a computer
Yeah.
all the time? That's all the writing you do?
Yeah.
Any other devices that you use?
I write longhand sometimes when I'm really stuck. I write sentences down. You slow yourself down and you think of sentences. You do the writing does progress by sentences, and you think of a sentence and write it down in longhand. And
So could you be in front of the computer monitor and then go to longhand?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
What's going on there? I don't know.
I think it's a question of finding the sentence, and it's too easy on the computer monitor. Also, you don't. The interesting thing is how many typos you produce on a computer as you go through it, and and I'm particularly bad about that. I read something for the 9th time, and I don't spot, and then somebody else looks at it and says, there's 28 typos in this. So I think you don't read the same way on the computer screen as you do longhand or something else, and it helps to write it out by hand.
Okay. And this is something that I talk to my students about missing those typos. Actually, the more you read it, especially on screen, the more likely you are to miss it. There's something going on.
And there are all these tricks. You read it from the back, from the
Right.
end forward. Reading aloud makes a huge difference. When I write Fresh Air pieces, I go over them orally with the producer, and then I see them all.
When you write, do you need to have certain things around you? In terms of your routine, do you have to have certain books with you? Do you?
Not. I mean, it depends what I'm writing, but no, nothing in particular.
Okay,
No.
just getting more quotidian. Coffee, tea, something else?
Coffee.
Okay.
Yeah, coffee.
Is that a must? Do you have to have that coffee?
Well, I have to have coffee before I start writing. I mean, before I do anything, I have to have coffee.
Okay. And when you're writing either a short piece or one of your longer pieces, do you write from beginning to end? Is it sequential? Do you know you're going to start here and end here?
No, never.
Never.
When I went to art school, I took a drawing course from a man named Marshall Glazer, who was a student of George Gross's and so on. And he taught drawing, figure drawing, and he'd have these beginners come in there and they'd say, "Where do I start?" And he'd say, "Hey, diddle, diddle, start in the middle." So I think that's my strategy for writing as well.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. I tell my students that as well. We talked a little bit about this, about revision, but I'm wondering if you can talk through the process. You write a draft. What happens after that, after you've written a first draft?
It depends. If you're writing for radio, you're aiming for 900 words. Or 875, 900 words. You might write 1,200 words and then go back and start cutting down. You write a sentence or you do a bit and you say, "This is too complicated. I can't spend 60 words on this." So and so. That's very present to me when I'm writing for radio. It's less present, obviously, when I'm writing a book or something like that. I think, well, this is a nice bit. I can put it in here and whatever. I mean, it does. So the revision process is very different. I like revising. That's the only part of the process that I really enjoy, I think.
Did you always like revising?
No, it's just easier than writing. I mean, you revise and you say, "Oh, this doesn't work," and so on and so forth. I mean, murdering your darlings, as the expression goes, is great fun. Is to take this out. I like this too much. I'm going to take it out. And
Do you have a trusted reader that you share your pieces with, or multiple readers?
there are a couple of people I talk to a lot. Paul Duguid, who's my colleague here at Berkeley, with whom I teach actually 2 courses, and I'll talk through things with him. A friend of mine who's retired now in the English department at UC Irvine. There's always wonderful ideas about words and so on. And I'll throw something at him and he'll always come back with something interesting.
What sorts of feedback do you get?
I was talking about pussy the other day with this piece, and he said, "You know what the real word in that piece is that nobody talked about, in that speech was that nobody talked about?" He says, "It wasn't pussy, it was grab," right? And I thought, of course, it's about grabbing things. And it was an obvious observation, but nobody had made it.
Right, right.
So, yeah.
Do you think you would have found that eventually on your own?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Do you enjoy writing, or do you more enjoy having written?
Oh, boy. There are moments of enjoyment when you come up with a little bit or a little, aphorism or something like that, and you polish it and so on. I used to enjoy it, I think, more than I do now, and that's a sad thing to say, but I don't, and I enjoy having written. Everybody enjoys having written. I was on the jury for a literary prize at Stanford, and one of the people, we were sitting at the table, and one of the people said, "Well, why do you?" He went around the table and said, "Why do you write?" to everybody. And everybody, "Do you enjoy writing?" And nobody said they enjoyed writing. And Tracy Kidder was there. He said to Tracy Kidder, "Why do you write?" He said, "I don't know. They look kind of nice on the shelf," he said.
Well, speaking of books, what do you read?
I read nonfiction. I read things for what I'm, in connection with what I'm doing. And one of the nice things about doing the fresh air stuff and other kinds of writing is you can read widely. If you're only in an academic field, you're apt to narrow your reading. And I read novels. You have to have something to lull you to sleep at night.
What's on your bedside right now?
I just finished the Colson Whitehead book, the Underground Railway. Terrific read. It's one of those things at 2 a.m. you're turning the page. It's a great storytelling. I'm not sure what I'll start. I just finished it the night before last, so I don't know what I'll start now. But I have a couple of things there.
Okay. Do you get ideas from fiction or the non-language related things that you read that might give you ideas for language things or things that you want to write about?
Sometimes I don't write enough about literary language. I mean, when I say I don't write enough, I would like to write more about it, and I occasionally have done things. I like to read good writing, and at the New Yorker, some of the better. I just read a long piece that Roger Angell did about being 96 years old, called "This Old Man." It's a wonderful essay, and I was just marveling at the phrases in it. Where does he pull these phrases from, and how does it happen? It's a mysterious process, and I'm not that good at it. And you read somebody like that, and you read it for the language too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What news sources do you read? Do you read traditional newspapers, print? Do you read online?
Like everybody does. I mean, the traditional newspapers, and now you look at your Twitter feed, and there are links to stories and some other. So everything. Yeah.
You name it.
Yeah.
This may seem like minutia, but there is a book that I couldn't find my own copy of. I took it out of the library, and the title is The Linguistics of Punctuation, and this was in the early 90s, I think this was published?
I think so, yeah.
And I was telling Jeff before he spoke that in this book, now mind you, it is about the linguistics of punctuation, someone took the liberty of, in pencil, in the margins, adding commas where they were, this reader thought that they belonged. So, you have your audience that would read these books. You seem pretty flexible. It seems that your philosophy is language is in flux, language changes. And when critics are adamant about they being used as a plural pronoun, can you talk a little bit about your philosophy?
Well, the they being used as a plural pronoun, I mean, it's been used, Jane Austen, whatever. I mean, people have been using it for a long time. We need a plural, we need a generic pronoun. I changed my Facebook pronoun to they. If you send them a birthday message, it says now, which is fine. But I don't see any problem with that. I mean, in certain contexts, you avoid it. In academic writing, you find ways to write around it. But in ordinary speech, I'm not the most. I mean, the linguists who are let it all hang out. I'm not really in that crowd. I think there are traditions you want to observe. I feel bad when I see a word losing its meaning. There's a kind of crepuscular sense of sadness that you can't do anything about it, but be ironic. But that's the best posture to take with regard to language, is irony. I know it's not used that way anymore. People use it this other way. I'm certainly not going to make a fuss about it, but I feel a little sad about it.
And do you have run-ins with the so-called grammar police?
Well, sometimes if I have an editor who's we go back and forth on this sort of thing. You have people who change your prose because they have ideas about it, and then you get angry and whatever. But I write about that a lot. I did a piece. There's a character at Wikipedia, one of the active editors at Wikipedia, who decided that comprised of is wrong because it's a passive. The house is comprised of 3 rooms. That's wrong. And he went about systematically purging that word from every Wikipedia article in which it appeared. This was something you could. And now it's silly. I mean, you've T.S. Eliot and all of these writers have used comprised of. It's not D.H. Lawrence and so on. And it's not really a passive. It's it's an odd construction in the sense we say he's possessed of a good disposition. It's not a passive. It's this kind of funny form of the active, and so he doesn't get the link. But he exercised what I think of as the pedant's veto, where you avoid using something not because you think it's wrong and not because most people think it's wrong, but because there are 9 people out there who think it's wrong, and you don't want to have that conversation. Except in this case, he could change 20,000 instances of the word. Sort of.
When you're teaching, how important is writing? Do you talk to your students about writing? How do you?
Well, I teach a big undergraduate class, and don't talk much about writing to them. And that's a problem. I mean, as you know here, everybody complains about student writing, undergraduate writing, but nobody wants to do anything, like the weather. Nobody wants to do anything about it, which is why what you guys are doing is important.
Yes.
my daughter didn't really get a lot of this stuff in high school and went to the University of Chicago, and we used to go back and forth. But I think, why didn't she get this stuff? Well, I should have been doing it. The graduate students, we do work with on the writing. In fact, we have at the School of Information, we have a seminar, kind of a pro seminar for how to be a researcher, how to be an academic seminar in various. And I teach a class there where I ask the students to do a write-up of their research for the Cal website, for their school, their college alumni paper, for something like that. To pick a particular source, The Atlantic, and write an article in the style of that source about your research. And it's astonishing to me how hard it is for them. Some of them get close, some of them just miss it by a huge amount. And I think that you've been reading this stuff for all your life, and you see it, and you haven't internalized the rhythms of it. It's like punctuation. You don't learn it from being taught. You learn it from internalizing it, and they haven't internalized it.
Okay. We're just about at the point where I want to open this up to the audience for questions. So if you do have a question, if you could raise your hand, and we have a microphone that will come around so that your question can be heard. So any questions for Professor Nunberg? You can. Looks like we have one here.
Would you say writing as well as like linguistic is empirical knowledge, or it's more of a priori knowledge?
The French writer Joubert once said, writing, I'll say it in French and then in English, une difficulté acquise, une facilité innée et une difficulté acquise. That is to say, you need an innate facility and an acquired difficulty. So there's some combination of those. Some people are better at it than others. Some people have the ear for writing and whatever. But nobody comes to write. I mean, there are very few prodigies in writing the way there are in mathematics or music. Occasionally you see that, but most writers don't kind of reach the ability to write until they're in their early 20s at the earliest. So it is something that has to be learned, I think.
Questions? Yeah, we'll bring the mic to you.
To whom?
Oh, sorry, right there.
Oh, okay, I'll take it. I'm just wondering, I came in late and you were talking about how taboo words are no longer taboo. Assuming they serve a answer a need in society, what comes next?
Well, I don't know if they're not taboo. I mean, there are two ways to think about it, and I think both are true. One is to say that we no longer have the words are no longer taboo. The other is to say they're still taboo, but we care less about the taboos. And there's a difference. I mean, to people of my generation, when somebody says that movie sucked, or bite me or something like that, I start, because it seems to me a very vulgar thing to say. Younger people just don't have that sense of that word. So in that case, the word is not as taboo as it once was. In other cases, like the F word and so on, I think there's still a sense of violating a taboo when you use the word, but people are more comfortable about violating that taboo in more context. Well, you can still shock with that language, and there's other language you can use to be shocking. But it isn't. When you use that word, you're breaking a rule. You may break it a lot, but you are breaking a rule, and it has that force.
So recently, with the election of President Duterte in the Philippines, he was noted for saying things like calling Obama a son of a bitch. And then you also have the Trumps. Do you think that there's a correlation between this kind of new rise of political crassness and what's going on in modern day politics, or?
Well, the Philippine case, I don't know. I don't know what phrase he used. I don't know what his native language is, and I don't, know what value that phrase has in that context. So I wouldn't try to make a judgment about that. In the case of Trump, I mean, the interesting thing about Trump is that he does swear, and he swears, I'm going to bomb the shit out of them, he says. And he says that in rallies and so on, which is really unusual. We have these cases in a world of live mics. You keep having cases. George Bush, during the 2000 presidential campaign, was overheard saying about a New York Times reporter to Dick Cheney, he's a major league asshole, and he went over the mic, and there was a fuss about it. Biden's remark to Obama at the signing of the health care bill, he whispered, "This is a big fucking deal," and again they made a fuss about it. But I mean, they were just swearing the way we swear in public life, in private life, and it happened to be overheard. In the case of Trump's things like bomb the shit out of them, that's really astonishing. That's shocking in a way, because that's the kind of word you don't deliberately use in public discourse. Now, how much of that is Trump and how much of it is a general tendency to use this language more in public life, it's hard to say. But there is the blending of public and private would lead to these words appearing more in public life than certainly they traditionally did. I mean, Harry Truman got in trouble for saying hell,
Do you think your writing style has changed over the course of your writing career?
I would be the last person to say that. I mean, I read stuff I wrote when I was in my 20s, and it certainly feels like a different person. But I couldn't tell you exactly what. I've always written sentences that were too long and used too many semicolons and so on. So I don't know that I can tell you the answer to that.
A question over on this side.
Use of the word like currently does that suggest more gravitas current day than maybe 20, 15 years ago? I recall a Fresh Air piece, use of the word like, and again, memory goes back, I think you might have said like, but when this conversation turned very serious, as in it might have been 9/11, the use of the word like ceased. They didn't use it. Are we hearing less of that today because of the gravity of maybe more seriousness in conversation?
I don't know that the conversation, I mean, it's certainly the case. In that piece, it's wonderful that you remember that piece. I made the observation that this involved a shooting down south in California, and a high school student. They were interviewing the students, and none of them used like. And there are kids who would normally use like. But in talking about a subject like that, somehow the irony and distance and whatever that like introduced wasn't appropriate, and they knew it. It wasn't just a verbal tick. They used it when it made sense. I don't know that conversation in general is graver than it was back then. I mean, certainly lots of stuff is going on and has always been going on. But if you look at, people still talk about sex and drugs and rock and roll most of the time, and in those cases, I take it they use like as much as they ever did. The so is the one that people get worked up about. The young woman here started a sentence with so in a way that's very common now, and I do it too. You say, so you were talking about whatever. And that's one that drives older people crazy. They send infinite numbers of letters to NPR and Fresh Air, because Terry Gross does it a lot. Give me a break. Is what
Speaking of words that disappear, have you noticed the disappearance of, in spoken language, of the verb are?
The verb?
Are.
Are?
Yes.
As in what?
everything is, even Michael Krasny, I've heard him do it. They use is rather than go switch to are, and I wonder if that has something to do with it's quicker to say is than are, because you have to think that this is a plural and I need to apply the plural here. But it's everywhere. It's on NPR, it's on the radio. R seems to have disappeared, except, in spoken language.
Well, my sense is probably it hasn't disappeared, but whenever whenever a sentence does involve a singular verb rather than a plural verb, and it should involve a plural verb, you're going to notice it. There's this effect where you hear something doesn't have to be very common for one to think, oh my goodness, that's going on all the time, because it does jump out at you. I don't know that this plural is replacing the singular in a general way in standard middle-class spoken American English. In other varieties of English, perhaps, but I don't know that that's happening.
I've noticed also myself for me.
That's been going on a long time.
Yeah.
As for myself, or so on, it's a stressed. It's a way of emphasizing. There are lots of times when it's appropriate. People use it too much, but I don't know that it's incorrect as much as ill-advised.
They may be the same.
You mentioned that there's a difference expectations if you're saying something in private versus in public. It seems to me with YouTube and with tweets and with Facebook pages, that line is getting very blurry. And I wonder how you're seeing that.
Yeah, I've thought that a lot of what goes on is in this space between the two. It's in public rather than being public. What people say on their Facebook pages and so on is stuff they say in public, in the sense that, presumably everybody can see it, or in YouTube videos and whatever. And I think that's the case. And I think a lot of what used to be private language has bubbled up into the public sphere. Though there is still, there's still the New York Times. There's still forms in which academic writing and so on, where you still hew to the traditional rules of public usage.
I agree with that. I also think, though, that there's a tremendous amount of incivility on YouTube, and I wonder how that culture is rippling into the broader culture.
Well, YouTube comments threads. NPR just said we're not going to do comments anymore. You can go to our Facebook page and make comments there and whatever. But if you go to Facebook, you're not anonymous. You're in your Facebook persona. So all over the place, people are now able to make the kind of remarks that they used to reserve for bathroom walls in all sorts of venues that are not public so much as in public. And it is a little disconcerting, more than a little disconcerting. And I don't know how it falls out. I don't know what happens in the end. There's a tendency toward the informal. There's a tendency toward the colloquial that's been going on really for a long time, since the 20s, and then became accelerated in the 60s, the 1960s. And I don't know where it's going to end.
And on that suspenseful note, we are out of time, so I want to thank you very much, Professor Nunberg, for joining us today.